Throughout history, there have been tragic events that, despite their seriousness, have not garnered the recognition they deserve. Here are 5 overlooked murder cases that warrant more attention. 1. The Dunbar School Massacre. The Dunbar School Massacre was a tragic mass shooting that occurred on March 13, 1996, when a gunman entered a primary school in the small Scottish town of Dunbar. He killed 16 young children and their teacher before taking his own life. The gunman, Thomas Hamilton, was a resident of the town. On the day of the massacre, he arrived at the school parking lot around 9:30 a.m. He severed the cables on a nearby telephone pole before entering the school, armed with 4 handguns, 743 rounds of ammunition, and wearing shooting earmuffs. As he made his way to the gym, he fired several shots. At that moment, teacher Gwen Mayer had just taken her 29 primary 1 students for their physical education class. Hamilton burst into the gym and immediately opened fire, injuring physical education teacher Eileen Harold and teaching assistant Mary Blake, while also wounding and killing several children. Harold and Blake sought refuge in a cupboard, trying to bring as many children as possible with them, while Hamilton continued shooting. When an adult and an older student attempted to look inside the gym to assess the situation, Hamilton fired at them before moving on to the library cloakroom and a mobile classroom, where students were lying on the floor as instructed by their teachers. He then returned to the gym, dropped the gun he was using, and chose another to take his own life. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes. Gwen Mayer and 15 children were killed instantly, with another child later dying in the hospital. Additionally, 15 others, mostly children, were injured. A motive for the massacre was never identified. Thomas Hamilton became an assistant Boy Scout leader at age 20, but soon attracted suspicion due to his behavior towards boys. Following additional complaints, he was asked to leave the Boy Scouts, which angered him. He repeatedly requested reinstatement, but his appeals were denied, and he wrote letters to various government officials claiming he was being persecuted. During this time, he became a gun collector and organized several boys' clubs where he taught shooting, gymnastics, and sports. Although his clubs were initially popular, his reportedly odd behavior and suspected pedophilic activities eventually drove away members and their parents, leading to the club's closure. Some reports also suggest he was rejected as a volunteer at Dunbar Primary School. Tennis star Andy Murray was a student in Dunbar during the massacre and later noted that he had attended Hamilton's boys' clubs as a child. 2. The Moore family murder. The Villisca axe murders took place during the night of June 10, 1912, in Villisca, Iowa. Inside the Moore home, 6 members of the Moore family and 2 guests were discovered brutally beaten. All 8 victims, including 6 children, suffered significant head injuries from an axe. A protracted investigation identified several suspects, with one being tried twice. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, while the second concluded with an acquittal. The victims included parents Josiah B., 43, and Sarah Nee Montgomery, 39, along with their 4 children. Herman Montgomery, 11, Mary Katherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, 7, and Paul Vernon, 5. The Moores were a wealthy family, well-respected and liked in their community. On June 9, 1912, Mary Katherine invited Ina May, 8, and Lena Gertrude Stillinger, 12, to spend the night at their home. That evening, the visiting girls and the Moore family attended the Presbyterian Church for the Children's Day program, which Sarah had organized. After the program concluded at 9:30 p.m., they walked back to the Moore's house, arriving between 9:45 and 10 p.m. At 7 a.m. on June 10th, Mary Peckham, the Moore's neighbor, grew worried when she noticed the family had not begun their morning chores. She knocked on their door, but when there was no response, she tried to open it and found it locked. Peckham let the Moore's chickens out and called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Like Peckham, Ross received no answer after knocking and shouting. He then used his copy of the house key to unlock the front door. While Peckham waited on the porch, Ross entered the parlor and opened the door to the guest bedroom, where he discovered the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger on the bed. He immediately instructed Peckham to contact Henry Hank Horton, Villisca's chief peace officer, who arrived shortly after. Horton's search of the house revealed that the entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah, was found in the guest room with the Stillinger sisters. Doctors determined that the murders occurred between midnight and 5 a.m. Two spent cigarettes were discovered in the attic, indicating that the killer or killers may have waited there until the family and guests fell asleep. The attack began in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore were resting. Josiah sustained more axe blows than any other victim, with his face so severely mutilated that his eyes were missing. A gouge mark on the ceiling suggested the murderer lifted the axe to strike. The killer used the blade of the axe on Sarah, while the blunt end was used on the other victims. Herman, Mary Katherine, Arthur, and Paul were similarly attacked. The murderer then returned to the master bedroom to strike Josiah and Sarah again, knocking over a blood-filled shoe before moving downstairs to the guest bedroom to kill Ina and Lena. Afterward, a 4-pound slab of bacon was removed from the icebox and placed next to the axe. Investigators also found untouched food and bloody water during their search. The scene was later contaminated when people were allowed inside to see if they might have committed the crime. Investigators believe that all victims except Lena Stillinger were asleep when they were attacked. They speculated that Lena was awake and attempted to fight back, as she was found lying across the bed with a defensive wound on her arm. Her nightgown had been pushed up to her waist, and she was not wearing any undergarments, leading law enforcement to consider the possibility that she had been sexually assaulted or that an attempt had been made. However, this was later disproven. As time passed, numerous potential suspects came to light, including Reverend George Kelly, Frank F. Jones, William Mansfield, Loving Mitchell, Paul Muller, and Henry Lee Moore, unrelated to the family. Kelly faced trial twice for the murder. The first trial resulted in a hung jury, while the second concluded with an acquittal. Other suspects in the investigation were also cleared of wrongdoing. 3. The Glenroy House murder. Police have stated that they remain committed to solving the brutal murders of a woman and her 3 children that occurred 54 years ago on Wednesday in a Glenroy home. Detectives are still looking for information regarding the whereabouts of Elmer Crawford, the husband and father, who a 1971 coronial inquest identified as the murderer. The Crawford family murder involved the killing of pregnant mother Therese Crawford and her 3 children in their home in Glenroy, Victoria, Australia, in July 1970. On July 2nd, the family car was discovered at the bottom of a cliff at Lockard Gorge in Port Campbell, with the bodies of all 4 victims still inside. Elmer Kyle Crawford, born May 1930, the husband and father of the victims, is the main suspect in the case and has not been seen since. 2 weeks prior to the murders, Elmer Crawford, an employee of the Victoria Racing Club, VRC, and his pregnant wife Therese created new wills that would grant Elmer a substantial inheritance in the event of their family's death. At the time of the killings, they had 3 children: Katherine Jane, 12, James William, 8, and Karen Jean, 6. Investigators believe that the imminent birth of their 4th child and Therese's mental state may have contributed to the murders. Another potential motive could be Elmer's theft of goods from the VRC. A coroner's inquest in July 1971 concluded that Elmer, who emigrated from Ireland in 1951, had murdered his wife and 3 children at their home on Cardinal Road in Glenroy. He allegedly constructed an electrocution device using a 15-meter, 49 feet, length of electrical lead and alligator clips, which he attached to Therese's ears while she slept before electrocuting her. He then killed Karen, presumably with a hammer found in the car, and electrocuted both Katherine and James. Elmer then placed the blanket-wrapped bodies, along with a motorbike, fuel cans, a rifle, and a hose, into the family's Holden FE sedan. He drove 200 kilometers, 120 miles, to Port Campbell, where he connected the hose from the exhaust to the driver's side window before pushing the car over the cliff in an attempt to make the crime appear as a murder-suicide, implicating his wife. To facilitate the car's movement, he also created a stone pathway across a drainage ditch in front of the vehicle. 4. Catherine Mary Glover. Catherine Mary Glover, also known as Mary Catherine Glover, was an Australian woman who took the lives of 6 of her children in Treebunna, Tasmania, on March 1, 1898, before ending her own life. Glover was married to George Glover, a special constable and watch housekeeper in Tribuna, with whom she had 8 children. At the time of the murders, her 2 eldest daughters were in service. The family originally resided in Parata before relocating to Tribuna. Parata is a small township in Tasmania, situated about 6 kilometers, 4 miles, southeast of the town of Oatlands. Although Glover experienced occasional bouts of depression, she did not suffer from any severe mental illness. However, her husband noted that she exhibited unusual behavior in the time leading up to the tragedies, mentioning that she would never wear a particular new jacket and suggested he keep it for his next wife. At one point, she attempted to buy laudanum. Laudanum is a tincture of opium that contains around 10% powdered opium by weight, which is equivalent to about 1% morphine. She tried to buy, but shopkeeper refused her due to her odd demeanor. On March 1st, Glover visited several stores in search of laudanum, but was unable to obtain any as it was out of stock. The 34-year-old also spoke with the landlady of a hotel about arranging accommodations for one of her daughters while she moved to a new house, eventually making plans with a woman named Pick. At that time, she seemed to be behaving normally. Later that day, Glover took her children, aged between 11 years and 4 months, into the bush and used a razor to cut their throats. After covering their bodies with a blanket, she walked about a mile to Spring Bay and drowned herself. Their absence was discovered when the daughter who had been sent to Mrs. Pick returned home to collect some belongings. She informed her father, Mr. Glover, who reported them missing that same evening. However, a search operation that night proved unsuccessful and had to be called off after dark. The search resumed the following morning, leading to the discovery of the deceased children, while Mrs. Glover's body was later found floating in shallow water by a coach driver. At the inquest held on March 4th, George Glover blamed Police Superintendent C. Griffiths and Warden Mace for his wife's suicide, claiming that they had pressured her into signing an apology for unspecified statements she had made. However, both officials were ultimately cleared of any responsibility. Later in March, the bodies of Mrs. Glover and 2 of her children were exhumed, and their intestines were sent to the government analyst to determine if poison had been administered before their deaths. The examination found no evidence of poison. 5. Mother and 5 of family murdered. On October 12th, a woman and her 5 children were found dead in a house on Mungalup Road, Collie, with their throats cut. The father of the family was later discovered hiding in the rafters above the kitchen and has since been charged with 6 counts of willful murder. The father, Raymond Armanasco, 40, a milk carter, was barefoot but fully dressed, wearing 2 pairs of trousers. He was found in the ceiling with a length of rope, blankets, tobacco, and a loaf of bread. The victims discovered around 4 a.m. included Elsie Mae Armanasco, 33, and her children, Loretta Mary, 12, Raymond Martin, 11, Francis K., 6, Philip Allen, 3, and Annette, 18 months. A blood-stained hammer and a razor were also found at the scene. The tragedy was uncovered by Herbert Ivan Furphy, a local dairyman, who visited the house to check on Raymond Armanasco, who had failed to complete his rounds. In the wash house, he found the body of the eldest boy, and he quickly alerted the police. Sergeant J.R. Ryan responded and discovered Mrs. Armanasco dead in a bedroom, with the bodies of Francis, Philip, and Annette on the floor nearby. Loretta was found deceased in the bathroom. One of the younger children's clothing was soaked, suggesting she may have been submerged in water, and she also had a throat wound. A few hours later, Elsie Rose Armanasco, 9, another daughter, was located at the home of Mr. Thomas Walton, where she had stayed the previous night. It was reported that her father had dropped her off there around 7 p.m. the night before, claiming that the rest of the family was out. Armanasco stayed for about 3 hours and appeared well-dressed and rational, although he mentioned some domestic issues. Earlier that evening, Elsie had received a message from a neighbor to go to the Waltons. She returned home around 6 p.m. to find the doors locked. A neighbor saw her crying outside, and shortly after, her father arrived and took her to the Waltons' house. When Mr. Walton learned about the deaths that morning, he recalled that Armanasco had seemed composed when he visited with Elsie, though he had made vague references to family troubles. Before leaving, Armanasco handed Walton £6 and requested that he send Elsie to his sister in Perth. Earlier that day, a woman had visited the Armanasco home to return clothes that had been drying in her yard. She reportedly saw blood on Armanasco's arms. He told her his wife was out and thanked her for the clothes. As police were collecting evidence at the scene, they began searching for Armanasco, who had not been seen since leaving the Waltons. When officers were about to leave the Armanasco home, they noticed plaster falling from the kitchen ceiling and a bulge above. Upon investigating, they found Armanasco hiding in the rafters. He was taken to the Cali police station and later charged with 6 counts of willful murder. Armanasco allegedly told police he had been in the ceiling most of the night and day, possibly while detectives were conducting their investigation. The Armanasco family had moved to Cali about 2 years ago after residing in Harvey and Kalgoorlie. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you next time.